Hello, Dr. Cole. Thank you very much, Professor Cole, for doing this. Truly appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's a real treat to have a world-renowned historian, address the following topics that we'll be talking on. And if I may, just give you a formal introduction. Professor Juan Cole is the Richard Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan. And for 4 decades, you have sought to put the relationships of the West and the Muslim world in historical context. And your most recent work, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a new translation from the Persian, and it's one of those fabulous books that you continuously publish. And of course, your book on Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, titled Prophet Muhammed, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires. This is the book that has completely, taken away so many people. I mean, with such an original scholarly work, and it's such a pleasure that we'll be talking today on it. And of course, you have translated so many other work. You have published over 100 academic papers and contributed to chapters. You speak many languages, and you're well traveled. You speak Arabic, Persian, and Urdu, and Turkish. And you surprised me last time we spoke privately. You spoke as well some understanding of ancient languages too. And so your books are available on Amazon. I just wanted to point that out to our viewers. And here they are. They're available, and both the book that we'll be discussing on Prophet Muhammad is available. You could buy it on Kindle, or of course you have the hardcover, and so many other books on Amazon. And of course, you founded a very insightful website that where you share your comments and articles on contemporary issues revolving what's happening today in the modern political world. It's called the Informed Comment. And of course, anyone wants to access that website. It's very insightful. You go to juancole.com as shown, Juan Cole, and here it is. So thank you, Professor. It's such an honor and a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Abdurrahman.
Thank you so much. So, your book on Prophet Muhammad, it's really special because you've used you published in it original scholarly work, and you've challenged some of these traditional assumptions that were found in the biography of Prophet Muhammad in a remarkable way, in an academic way. So you essentially, as a methodology, used the Quran as your primary text, as your primary source, and then you supplemented it with your understanding of the geopolitics of that era. And so you had this beautiful holistic approach in understanding the story of Prophet Muhammad and what the Quran was actually trying to communicate of these various messages. And then if you may let me, and you can correct me too, you flushed the traditional seerah. I mean, the traditional autobiography that exists on Prophet Muhammad. You flushed it and you saw what corroborates with the Quran. If it doesn't corroborate with the Quran, then you would kind of challenge some of the assumptions found within the traditional seerah. Did I summarize that as much as possible, as good as I can?
Correct. I feel that what I brought of an original nature to this historical project was to depend on the Quran as my primary source to the extent that I was able to, and then to set it in what is now known as late antiquity, and in the period roughly 300 to 800 of the Common Era, the period after Constantine's as the Roman emperor after he gave his support to
Mm.
Christianity as the state religion, or at least his descendants did. And it was a period, the 500s, the early 600s in the Near East, that was dominated by the Romans on the one hand and the Sasanian Iranian Empire on the other. The Sasanians had Yemen from 570, for instance, uh, and um, and the two, I argue, well, the two were at war between 603 and roughly 630. Um, and I argue that it is that war, which I call a world war, that is the historical context for the Quran and the preaching of the Prophet Muhammad.
It's quite interesting and fascinating when you put the geopolitics of that era into perspective, because there was a world war, and as you rightly call it, between these huge and two empires, and yet, if I may, I share this map, and I hope it's a map that belongs to the era that we're referring to.
Yes.
As you can see, Quraysh and where the Prophet Muhammad was born, it's like nestled in between these two empires, where you see the Persians were up in the northeast, but they at that time as well they were in Yemen, and then you have the Romans up north. And so it was kind of interesting to see what the Quraysh people and the Arabians in the middle, they must have felt, they must have been worried. And so now when I read Surat, Quraysh, لإلاف قريش إلافهم رحلة الشتاء والصيف فليعبدوا رب هذا البيت الذي أطعمهم من جوع وآمنهم من خوف. And now as a Muslim, and I've known this for surah for a while now, when I read this verse in the Quran, it makes now more sense that they were afraid of something. And essentially this verse communicates how God has bestowed on them this favor of essentially not being entangled in a major conflict, since they were nestled between these two fighting empires. Does that, I thought to get your comments on it too.
Oh yeah, well I think that's right. The Quraysh had depended heavily on trade, from what the Quran says. Mecca was in a lava basin. It was kind of like Hawaii, and so it wasn't very good farmland. And I think they had to trade to survive. And the likelihood is that they traded down to Yemen and up to, and they traded up to then to the Roman Empire, up to Damascus. And the later Muslim sources, which have to be taken with a grain of salt because they are late, they're 150, 200, 300 years after the fact, but they often mention a trading connection for the Meccan Hijazis to Damascus, to Gaza, to these northern Roman cities. And there's also evidence in them of a connection then down south to Sana'a and Aden. And I think one of the things that likely was going on was that the Romans put stiff tariffs on any goods coming from the Iranian Empire into the Roman Empire, as much as 30%. But I think what the Hijazis were probably doing was going down to Aden, picking up Iranian goods like silk, and then bringing them up to Transjordan and to Damascus and selling them. And since they weren't Iranian, I think they got away with not paying that stiff tariff. And this may be one of the ways that they were making their money.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? So they found an arbitrage opportunity, and then my background is finance, so it seems that they were able to kind of circumvent the 25-30% tariff as mentioned in your book, and they would sell it at this at a very profitable margin up north, and it was kind of a lucrative trade. And this is why essentially Quraysh, and as you mentioned in your book, they try to maintain a neutrality and not to be entangled between picking sides, either with the Persians, the Sasanians, or the Romans. Do you feel purely because of economic reasons, but or a mixture of belief system? But I thought just to get your put into it too.
Yes, well, I think that initially their hope was to remain independent. They had, a strange political system from our point of view, in that they didn't have a state,
Mm,
and they were hostile to having a state. They're kind of libertarians, tribal libertarians. They had a word in Arabic for an acephalous political system, a system that didn't have a political center or head. They said they were laka,
mm,
and they didn't want it. So there's one story that at some point in the late 500s, early 600s, there was a politically minded operative in Hijaz who was well connected and who contacted the Romans and said, "Well, how would you like me to represent your interests in Mecca and Medina?" And the Romans had a custom of appointing Arab tribal leaders to protect their territory, to raise tribal cavalry as guardians, basically, of the Roman Empire, and to project Roman influence into their regions. And those tribal leaders in Arabic, they were called Malik, which didn't mean king; it meant kind of tribal leader. But in Greek, they were called Phylarch. And so this guy in Mecca was probably volunteering to be the Phylarch of the Hijaz for the Romans. And so he took it, according to later sources, he took this project to the Meccan elite, and they turned him down. They said, "No, we're Laka. We don't have Phylarchs. We don't have anybody, at the center of political power." And there was, the anthropologists called the system of tribal rivalries without a strong center a segmentary lineage system. Means that it was a republic of cousins, and at any point, one cousin could hive off and form their own tribe, their own clan, their own household, and then maybe they'd be at odds with the others. So there were always feuds going on, and but there was no state. And I think if the later sources are correct, the local people liked it that way. They didn't want a state, and I think they hoped not to get too involved in Roman or Sasanian affairs, except as trading opportunities presented themselves. But I think the war that broke out inevitably involved them. Yeah, go ahead.
That's quite fascinating, right? But it seems that Mecca would at sometimes would find itself drawn into these frequent mini conflicts internally. Like for instance, you do have groups within the Arabian Peninsula, within the Hijaz, who took essentially some like sides. You have the Arab Christians up in the north east, and then those who kind of they had an interesting relationship at one point, and you can correct me. They were with the Romans, but then they would side with the Sasanians because of this theology issues with the Chalcedonians and the if you remind me what the Chalcedonians and the
Miaphysites.
Miaphysites, yes. And at the same time, you had the Jewish community in the Arabian Peninsula in Hijaz, who really weren't really trusting the Romans, and they'd rather work or ally somehow with with the Sasanian Persians because of their experiences, the past experiences of being expelled from Palestine by the Romans, and so they had their own suspicion. So the area, even though they tried to maintain their neutrality, the area was kind of charged a little bit. Until Prophet Muhammad comes into picture in Mecca and starts preaching this amazing monotheistic tradition, the Abrahamic tradition of accepting Jesus Christ, Moses, and accepting the one God as the true God, and then that troubled Mecca, because that now they feel that they're going to go and be kind of labeled as siding with the Romans. Is that how they viewed Prophet Muhammad?
Yeah, it's a little speculative on my part, but I think that there were a lot of important merchants in Mecca and Taif and other cities who were strongly tied to the Aden trade, and so had to have good relations with the Sasanians. And they didn't want to be identified as pro-Roman. But I think if you have a prophet amongst you who's preaching Jesus and Moses, that's going to be perceived as potentially a pro-Roman Christian point of view. Because remember, by this time, most people in the Roman Empire had converted to Christianity. The emperor of the Roman Empire was a Christian and was an upholder of Christian forms of orthodoxy. And so if the prophet is talking about Jesus, the son of Mary, and calling him a prophet and so forth, from an Iranian Zoroastrian point of view, because they had their own religion and their own religious tradition, that looks suspicious. And we know that these dilemmas existed. We do have, I think, pretty good historical sources on this issue. For instance, there was a small Arab dynasty in Hira in Iraq, near what is now Kufa, and they sided with the Sasanians. They were very heavily under Sasanian influence because the Sasanians ruled what is now Iraq at that time. It was part of the Iranian Empire. And however, they were intrigued by Christianity. And a lot of Arabic speakers had become Christians up north in what is now Syria. And so the later Hira rulers embraced Christianity. And according to the later Muslim sources, the Sasanians became very suspicious of their vassals, the Hira Lakhmid dynasty.
Yes.
And so they were Nasrids. They crushed them around 600. So maybe 10 years before the Prophet started preaching, the Sasanians had cracked down hard on this Arab group because despite their loyal service, and they used to invade the Roman Empire for the Sasanians, but because they converted to Christianity, they became suspicious of them and crushed them. So this story was certainly known in Mecca and Medina, and so people over there might have been a little afraid of the Sasanian garrisons in Yemen and what would happen if they became strongly identified with Christian Roman loyalty.
So if we take some steps back prior to the Sasanian involvement in Yemen, because most of the Sasanians were not really in Yemen until 570, and something happened in Yemen. We mentioned, by the way, that we'll be making our talk a bit, we'll be focusing a little bit on Yemen, so we'll be back and forth to Yemen. Something incredible happened, which is mentioned in the Quran. It is Al-Ukhdud event, Ashab al-Ukhdud. And in Christianity, it's really referred in as the martyrdom of Saint Arethus, or Al-Harith in Arabic. And this is truly like, when I read about it, and you kind of suggested that I read a book by by an author, Brauck. I'll have to remember the title.
Bowersock.
Bowersock, yes, the throne of Adulis. And he mentioned about this incident, which happened in 570, where a Jewish king from Yemen, a Himyarite Jewish king, persecuted Christians in Najran, and it was just a major event. And to this day, by the way, if you see these pictures, I found them. These are the this is in Najran nowadays, Saudi Arabia, where you have this city that was essentially put on fire by the Yemeni king, the Himyarite, and so this persecution invited the Sasanians. And you see, it's all about this geosecurity, geopolitics event. So I thought just to get your input about the motivation behind that sort of persecution by the Jewish Yemeni king. Is it to, again, repel any the Romans from the region, or to show that the Yemeni king will be somehow she's looking for somehow an alliance with the Sasanians. What do you suggest? Your thoughts on this?
The archaeologists and historians have, in the past 40 years, completely changed our view of Yemeni history in this period, the period before the rise of Islam. The great French archaeologist Christian Robin has been at the forefront of these developments. There have been a number of others. Bowersock wrote this wonderful book, The Throne of Adulis, which is one of my favorite history books.
Well, thank you for suggesting it. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
It really is about Yemen in this period. So the image that has emerged from this archaeological work, it tells a remarkable story. So the Himyarite kingdom in what is now Yemen had been a polytheist kingdom, and they worshipped gods and had state-sponsored temples to the gods. But the archaeologists found that around 380 of the Common Era, those temples suddenly were abandoned. And they don't seem to have been worshiping there any longer. And then there are inscriptions in Sabaic, in the Himyari ancient language, which is akin to Arabic, but it's its own language. Those inscriptions start talking about one God, who's often called, in that old language, Rahmanan. So instead of al as the definite article before the word, they put an N after the word to make it definite. So al-Rahman would be Rahmanan in the old language. And there are lots of inscriptions about the worship of the All-Merciful, of the merciful God. And this is a word for God that does exist in the Hebrew Bible. And some of the inscriptions have a Jewish overtone to them. So the archaeologists think that probably what happened was that the Himyari royal family converted to Judaism and so abandoned the worship of the gods. It's a little complex, however, because some of the inscriptions don't mention anything about Judaism. And one of them seems to distinguish between the God of the Hebrew Bible and Rahmanan. So it may be that there was an indigenous turn to monotheism, where this all-merciful God began being worshipped in general. But then some portion of the worshippers of the all-merciful became Jews. In any case, it's certainly the case that by the late 400s, a Jewish dynasty was ruling what is now Yemen. And Yemen always had a rivalry with Christian Ethiopia. And Ethiopia, in turn, was allied with the Roman Empire.
Mm.
And so the Emperor Justinian, who ruled the first half of the 500s from Constantinople, wrote to the Negus, the ruler of Ethiopia, and said, the Iranians have a lot of economic influence and political influence in Yemen, in that Jewish-ruled Yemen, the Himyari kingdom. And that is a difficulty for Roman commerce, because the Romans wanted to send ships through the Bab el-Mandeb to Sri Lanka, which was a major trading node in Asian trade to get silk and so forth. So they were afraid that the Jewish kingdom in Yemen would pirate their ships if they tried to go out through the mouth of the Red Sea. So Justinian encouraged the Ethiopian king to invade Yemen and overturn the Jewish kingdom, which Ethiopia did. They sent in armies in the 520s.
And it seems that the ancient Ethiopia have always kind of the kings, and after reading the book, The Throne of Adulis, it seems that the Ethiopian kings were always kind of boasting about being having hegemony over the Red Sea and across the Red Sea to the Himyarite kingdom, and you see the titles bestowed on the Ethiopian kings at the kings of Himyar, Reidan, and so on. So even so, they were actually like they didn't need the push from the Romans. I mean, they themselves were already kind of motivated to kind of instill their presence in Yemen. And it seems because of religion as well. I mean, they wanted to be really connected to the temple of Sheba, because this is where this is according to the book, they trace their lineage to, this is how religiously they trace their lineage to the Queen of Sheba, who eventually married King Solomon. And so there is definitely a religious tone, I guess, to it. But at the same time, it seems that the Romans as well kind of pushed them to and supported their expeditions into Yemen.
So in 523, before the Ethiopian invasion, the then Jewish king of Yemen persecuted the Christians of Najran. But as you say, I think that this was it occurred in a geopolitical context of a kind of vague Himyari Iranian alliance and a fear of the Christians of Najran that they would be pro-Ethiopian, pro-Roman, and that resulted in this religious violence against the Christians of Najran, which, as you say, was a famous and notorious and a major incident that many Christian writers, took up this theme of the martyrs of Najran. And then, so the Ethiopians invaded and they took over, but one of the generals of the Ethiopian army, Abraha,
yes,
was ambitious. And so once he was off in Yemen and the Ethiopian army controlled Yemen, he rebelled against the Ethiopian king and declared himself an independent monarch. And he ruled for much of the 500s in Yemen as a Ethiopian Christian, but establishing a state in what is now Yemen, and was very powerful. And there are inscriptions which survive of his expeditions up to the Hejaz. So he boasts that he conquered Yathrib around 550, 554, I think. And this is not, by the way, in the traditional Arab materials. There is a story of Abraha trying to take Mecca and then being repulsed supernaturally. And in the year that Muhammad was born. And so there is an inscription which suggests that Abraha did try in the mid to late 560s to take the Hijaz again. And I think it must have been around 567, because there are two ways of figuring the Prophet Muhammad's birth, and some of the traditional sources say that he was born in 570, but some suggest that he was born 3 years earlier than that. So in 610, when he announced his first revelations, some authors say he was 40 and some say he was 43. So I've concluded that since we have this inscription that Abraha tried to invade the Hijaz in the late 560s, and since we have these allegations that the Prophet was born 567, that the two come together, and that we may have a firmer basis for the birth date of the Prophet because of this. But in any case, the Ethiopian Christians persecuted the Jews once they came to power, and also were, of course, very anti-Sasanian, and so Iranian interests suffered. And so by 570, the Sasanians had decided to come back. And this time they invaded Yemen themselves. They sent a fleet, and their naval officers conquered Yemen and took it over. There may have been some surviving pagans and Jews who gave support to the Sasanians. Roban doesn't think so. He thinks that everybody had been persecuted to death and that they were just Christians. But in my experience as a historian, you can't completely wipe out groups. And so the Sasanians came back and they ruled Yemen as a kind of military vassal state from 570 until the late 620s. And it was during the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime, if you said Yemen, you were saying Iran. So Mecca was very much between the Roman Empire and the Sasanians in Yemen.
No, that's fascinating. It seems even well, before I talk, I just thought to show you these two pictures. You've seen them, I'm sure, from the Throne of Adulis book, and these are actually are in, one of them is in Yemen, and it discusses again the Ethiopian expeditions. And so, as you said, I mean, these are things that are available to investigate. I mean, there are inscriptions, and I just found it fascinating that we still have these very important artifacts, these important inscriptions where we can trace back, as you said, the dates and so on. And it seems that Abraha's expedition into Al-Hijaz, he might have well divided his expedition, one going to Mecca and the other one goes to Yathrib, I guess. I mean, this is, I believe your book had mentioned this, is it, or maybe it's another book. But so I don't see how it could negate the traditional or undermine the traditional seerah. It seems that the expedition that went to Mecca, something happened along the way, and this is what some of these inscriptions say, that they faced some kind of an issue, and of course the Quran describes what happened. But it's interesting to know that they managed to capture Yathrib, and this is where you said they started persecuting some groups within Yathrib who are maybe aligned with the Sasanians, like the Jews and other pagans. Now, the Sasanians' involvement in Yemen came after the Yazan. He's a Yemeni Jewish Himyarite who tried actually to rally international support. Now we go back to geopolitics. for his cause to kind of kick out the Ethiopians, or trying to liberate Yemen from Ethiopia. And correct me if this is correct, wrong. At one point, the Himyarites were trying to persuade the Romans to intervene, and they failed in rallying Arab support to help Yemen to, as well, fend off or liberate it from Ethiopia. Would that
Sure.
make sense? Yeah. So you wrote in the book something extremely interesting, which is the pre-prophetic career of Prophet Muhammad as a merchant, as a commerce, someone who engaged in international trade. So you discussed his trips all the way north to Palestine during the summertime, and then down south to Yemen. And I find it extremely important that in the traditional seerah, it seems that they either avoided discussing it for some reason, or they felt that this is unnecessary, and that what really matters is the prophetic career. Or are there other motives? I thought just to get your input on it too.
Well, the later Muslim tradition admits forthrightly that the Prophet Muhammad was a long-distance merchant. However, it only tells two anecdotes about his trading life. So it doesn't bulk large in what's called the Seerah, or the biography of the Prophet. Interestingly, the Christian scholars writing in Syriac or Armenian in the 600s, in the decades after the Prophet's death, say that he regularly traded up north to the Roman Empire. And they talk about him going to Damascus annually. And they also indicate that he went on trading up north after the revelation started coming to him. And these are earlier, like the first sort of long major biography of the Prophet from the Muslim side is by Ibn Ishaq, and we have a good deal of that in other redactions, and that's probably from the 760s. So the Prophet Muhammad died in 632, so it's 130 years later. But some of these Christian sources are 50 years or 90 years after the Prophet's death. And they're, I think, retaining this knowledge that the Prophet was a long-distance merchant, that he traveled regularly, and that he went on traveling even after the revelations came to him. And so it gives a slightly different view of the Prophet Muhammad. I think, the Western Orientalist tradition tended to see him as somehow narrow, as a man of the desert who maybe didn't know the wider world, and so forth. And if he was, in fact, a long-distance merchant who regularly traveled to Damascus, then on the contrary, he would have been a very cosmopolitan person. He would have known languages besides Arabic, and he would have known cultures, the Christian. If he went to Yemen, he would have known something about the Zoroastrians. And of course, there was a Jewish community in Medina. And if we think about the Quran as coming through the Prophet's mind, at least, he's, Western academics wouldn't be comfortable in saying that the Quran is necessarily the word of God if they're not believers. But I think, and Muslims wouldn't be comfortable with phrases like Muhammad, composed the Quran, because they think it comes from God. But I try to strike on a middle path here, that wherever you think the Quran is coming from, and if it's from God, it doesn't come without mediation. I mean, the whole point of having a prophet or a messenger is someone to bring the message, and the Quran is forthright about this. That if people heard disembodied words in the sky, they would just run away. You wouldn't be able to convince them about anything to be afraid. But if your friend, if your brother, if your cousin says, "Well, I have this message from God," then he might get a hearing. So, but then the problem there is that the messenger has to speak the language of the local people, and that language has a history, and there are things you can say in it, things you can't say in it, references that are known, references that are not known. So I'm arguing that even if one looked at it as revelation, the fact that it comes through the prophet means that the prophet's biography and the prophet's world, the prophet's culture, all become imbricated in the Quran itself. And so when we read the Quran, there are some indications that maybe some of it was recited by the prophet up north in the Roman Empire. For instance, at one point, the Quran tells the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and how Sodom was destroyed because of its wickedness. And then it says to the people who are listening, it says, "And you pass by it every morning."
Yes.
Well, if they're in Mecca, if he's talking to Meccans, how are they passing by Sodom every morning? I mean, Sodom was in Palestine. The ancients used to think it was near the Dead Sea or near Jericho. So I conclude that when the prophet was reciting that verse, he was addressing Arab tribes up in Transjordan or in Palestine, that they were passing by Sodom every morning. So this is not denied by the later tradition. They admit that he was a long-distance merchant, that he traveled, but they don't say anything about it. But I think if we use the Christian sources and if we use the Quran itself, we can get a picture of the prophet as a cosmopolitan figure, as somebody who travels widely, who knows the world. And I think that is reflected in the Quran.
As you said, just looking at what he preaches, there is this verse in the Quran where it says, even though the Quran is in Arabic, but it communicates to a vast amount of groups of people: Christians, Jews, polytheists, monotheists, Zoroastrians. And so for the Prophet, peace be upon him, to be able to travel up north and south and to see and to witness, that's completely, that's plausible very much. But I think some scholars, and I personally find it a bit narrow-minded, is that they think that this could somehow confuse people or promote the Islamophobia and the medieval scholars who were trying to undermine Islam and the Quran by saying that the Quran borrowed from various scriptures in putting together. But the Quran in itself, if you read it, and leaving theology aside, but if you compare it, it's there are stories that are similar to the Bible and to the Torah, but by themselves they're unique, and they tell and there are portions of it where it expands even more. And I thought just to see if you had anything to add on this specific issue.
Yeah, well, a lot of even Western academics who are not believers have made this point, that the Quran is an extremely original work. And sure, it has biblical materials in it, stories that are retold from the Bible, but they're, as you say, told from a particular and different point of view. They often have details in them that are not the same as the Bible. And that was very common. Rabbis and Christian preachers would take a biblical text as their subject for a sermon or a homily in the late antique world, and they would retell the story, maybe with some local flavor. And I think the Quran does a lot of that. This charge that the Quran that the Prophet borrowed is silly because it was his culture. He didn't borrow anything. Uh, the people that he was addressing knew these stories already. So he took the stories and used them for moral teaching and put a point on them. But that's the value added of the Quran. It's not that nobody had ever heard of Solomon before. It's how the story of Solomon is told so as to bolster his faith. And I think the Quran kind of admits this because there's also been a new discovery about the story of the sleepers, the young men who were Christian believers who were being persecuted by the pagan Romans in 250 by the Roman Emperor Decius. And they escaped persecution by going into a cave, and then they fell asleep according to this pious legend, and they slept for 200 years, miraculously. And then they awoke. And to find, after Constantine, that they awoke into a Roman Christian empire, and so there was a kind of miracle that they, on awakening, they found that their faith had spread. And the Quran tells this story, and it's known in the West as the seven sleepers of Ephesus, which is a city which is now in Turkey. There are several Syriac versions of it. There may be a Greek original, we don't know. And it's not always seven sleepers, as the story is told. There are multiple ones, which also the Quran mentions. Mm-hmm. But in the Quran, it locates them not in Ephesus, but in Raqim. And Raqim, we now know, is the old Nabatean word for Petra in Jordan. So when the Quran tells the story of the sleepers, it's not the sleepers of Ephesus up north in the Greek-speaking Roman Empire. It's the Christian sleepers of Petra, which had converted also to Christianity, but was ruled by the pagan Romans, and there were Christians of Petra who were persecuted, and Bostra and so forth. So you can see how the Quran is reworking these materials that were circulating and which were localized, but the point of the story is the same, which is that if people just stand firm in their faith, ultimately their faith will prevail. That's the point of the stories of the sleepers, both in the Quran and in the Christian literature. I speculate, by the way, that the story might have been especially meaningful during the time that the Prophet was preaching. This surah, I think, is maybe 616, 617. And at that time, the Iranians had conquered the Roman Near East. So what is now Jordan, Palestine, Syria, Egypt, it was all being ruled by the Iranians. If you wanted permission to do anything, you had to ask the Iranian general. The Zoroastrians were in control. So I think it may be that the Quran is retelling this story to give heart to the defeated Christians of that era, and also to the Muslims who support, the biblical tradition, that in the same way that Decius's persecution was ultimately defeated by Constantine's conversion and the Christianization of the Roman Empire, in the same way Christianity will come back to the Near East. It's just speculation on my part, but if we wanted a political and geopolitical context for why the Quran might be telling this particular story set in Petra, I think that would be it.
Well, that's interesting. And you released. I think your paper has been circulated for some time. Maybe I read it just a couple of days ago about the origins of the word Islam,
Hmm.
and is Prophet Muhammad coming in with a new religion, or simply continuing the Abrahamic tradition of his of the of the former prophets, and carrying the baton, let's say. And that paper is just an amazing paper. So thank you very much. And I think it's just as it adds a point to what you're trying to highlight, is the inclusivity of the Quran in its stories, about these various stories that are found in the Torah and the Bible, but expanding it and trying to put and to relate it. So essentially, to have a discourse with all these various groups. So Prophet Muhammad, while he was in Mecca, he was continuously being persecuted, and it just became untenable for him or for his companions. So the first hijrah was actually to Ethiopia, where he asked his companions to go to this Christian king who is just, and you will be fine, and he will protect you. And so I thought, just to get your point of view, or any comments there, because it seems it has geopolitical ramifications as well. Um, when the believers of Prophet Muhammad went to Ethiopia and cemented now this image that now they're kind of in alliance with the Christians.
Well, I think that the Quran is full of indications that the early Muslim community around the Prophet Muhammad and the Prophet himself were pro-Roman in this war. Uh, Personally, I think it's because the Quran disapproves of aggressive warfare, and the Iranians invaded the other empire's territory, so they were the aggressors. And I think the Prophet didn't approve of that. Um, so yes, in Surah Rum, the beginning of the chapter of Rome, the Quran contains a prediction. It says that Rome lies vanquished in the nearest province, but in the wake of their defeat, they will triumph after a few years. And then it goes on to say something very remarkable. It says that before and after is God who is in command, not Khosrow II, not the Iranian emperor. And on that day, when the Romans come back, the believers will rejoice in the victory of God. So the victory that's predicted of Heraclius, the Roman emperor, is identified as the victory of God by the Quran. And it shows that the God of the Quran works in history and is universal, can use a Christian king for his purposes, and the believers will rejoice at God doing so. And I think that this verse shows very clearly the political sympathies of the Prophet and the early believers for the Christian Romans. And remember, when the verse is coming down, the Iranians have conquered the Near East. And then they have Yemen. So it's also a pretty dangerous thing to say. It's a very brave thing to say.
Yes.
At that time. The earliest long commentary on the Quran that survives is from after 750. So again, a long time after the Prophet's death. But it's by Muqatil bin Sulaiman al-Balkhi. He was way out there in Afghanistan. But he has a commentary on this verse in which he says that it refers to the Roman losses in what is now Syria, in the Transjordan, as the Iranian troops advanced. And then he tells an anecdote that the local pagan Meccans were supporting Iran, were rooting for it. It was like football teams. And that they taunted Muhammad and the Muslims. And they said, you're in the biblical tradition, and you just have the one biblical God, and your guys just lost. Whereas we're pagans, and the Iranians, they're not biblical. They're Zoroastrians, and so they're our team. And we just handed you a big defeat, guys. This is, although it's over a century after the Prophet's death, this text, it's nevertheless the earliest long commentary on the Quran, and I think it retains a kernel of truth, that there was a sense of being pro-Roman among the early believers around Muhammad, and pro-Sasanian among the pagan Meccans.
Yeah, I mean, it does make sense now looking back. Some time ago when I used to come across this verse, and I would read the available commentaries of Al-Tabari and so on. So you would not really get the gist, or the essence of the verses until you came and you published your book, which makes sense. I mean, it is why would then the believers be so happy about this Roman victory, and the Quran essentially is supporting, as taking sides essentially with the Romans, and because of what you said. Essentially because they were not the aggressors but the Sasanians. So it's the principle of aggression, and I think it would be a nice discussion now on Medina, because now you have Prophet Muhammad. He is in Medina, and he was received by the tribes of Medina. And in Medina you had the Jews and the various Arab tribes, and but when he went to Medina, he didn't go there as a ruler. As you said in your book, he came in as like a senator, as someone who would broker peace among these fighting factions within Medina, and they badly wanted someone with such ethics to come in, and so he comes, and then they put together a framework called the Constitution of Medina, and it's such a remarkable constitution because it gives liberties to religion, traditions, and essentially it kind of puts these various monotheistic traditions into one camp, the Christians, the Jews, and the believers, and puts this umbrella above them, which is Islam. And so I thought just to hear your comments on the impact of this constitution, and why nowadays we don't have much literature on this constitution of Medina. We badly needed one, so that's why.
The text of the Constitution of Medina is, as you say, a remarkable document. My general approach, as we mentioned at the beginning of the show, is to privilege the Quran as my primary source. And I think you have to, as a historian, treat the materials that are much later as carefully, because there were folk processes, people told stories, and they grew in the telling, and so forth. But even the most skeptical academic scholars think that the Treaty of Medina, which is reproduced in these later Abbasid era sources, is an authentically early 7th century document, that it comes from the 620s from Medina. The language is archaic, and the attitudes in it don't actually fit the Abbasid attitudes very well. And so you can see some of the words are used differently than they were later. Now, in later Islam, the word ummah came to mean the Muslim community. So you talk about Muhammad's ummah, or the Islamic ummah, as it's the Muslim community as opposed to other communities. But in the in the Constitution of Medina, the ummah is everybody who accepts the Prophet Muhammad as the mediator. So at one point it says that the Jews and the believers, that is to say the Muslims, are one ummah. But they have their deen, they have their religion, and we have ours. So in this document, the ummah is multicultural, and the more narrow word is deen, which identifies the particular religion of Muhammad or of Judaism. But the ummah is overarching. That's not how the word was used later on. And it's one of the ways we think we know that the Constitution of Medina is an early document, because it does use words in ways that might have been common in the 620s and which later on took on different connotations.
So it seems it seems that even Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, even in his personal life, he kind of tried to enforce that unity, even through his marriages. He was married to Maria al-Qibtiyya, she's a Coptic Christian, and actually she gave him a son, Ibrahim, but he died at an early age. And as well, he was married to Safiya bint Yahya. Her background is Judaism. She's Jewish, from a Jewish tribe. So it seems that he was really serious about walking the talk as well, and trying to ensure that his message or that his religion is actually encompassing all these monotheistic Abrahamic traditions. But then I thought to get your input on when the Qibla changed from, because they were essentially praying towards Jerusalem, and they were so the believers with Prophet Muhammad were kind of unified with the Christians and the Jews in their prayer direction. But in Medina now, this prayer shifted, and the Qibla, or the destination of prayer, now it's towards Mecca. Is that an essentially trying to differentiate his people into accepting this general umbrella of accepting one another, because there were so much issues and problems between the Christians and the Jews, and they were not accepting each other? And yet, so I thought just to get your input on the significance of the Qibla and the change.
Well, in some ways, many of these issues are murky for a historian. There are lots of stories in the later literature about them. It seems clear from the Quran that the early believers in Mecca did pray towards Jerusalem, which is also how Jews pray. And so this was a Judaic practice that was adopted by the early community. There is one story which I find very intriguing, that they prayed standing behind the Kaaba, standing south of the Kaaba, so that they could pray towards the Kaaba, which was the shrine to God, and to Jerusalem at the same time, since Jerusalem is north of the Kaaba. If you stood south of it and faced north, then you could hit both. And I think in the Quran there's some mystical connection between the Kaaba, this house of God in Mecca, and the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, which of course at this time no longer existed. The Romans had destroyed it. But worship on the Temple Mount may have been revived during the Sasanian-Iranian period. There's some evidence of that. Then we know from the Quran that after the community went to Medina, after the Hijra or immigration in 622, a little bit after that, they were instructed to pray towards Mecca from then on. But think about it physically, is that when they were in Mecca, they could stand south of the Kaaba and pray north, so that they could pray towards both the house of God in the Hijaz and the house of God in Jerusalem. When they went to Medina and they were denied access to the Kaaba and Mecca, they were exiled from it, they couldn't do that anymore. So then they had to make a choice. And the choice was for the house of God in the Hijaz, which was, after all, their immediate tradition. So some historians have said, well, it was a declaration of independence from Judaism. Well, I don't think they ever thought they were Jews. The Quran doesn't read like that in the Mecca period. Or it indicated maybe a friction with the Jews of Medina, but the Treaty of Medina, the Constitution of Medina, actually talks about the Jews being in the same ummah. So there's not evidence of friction in the earliest sources. So I think it was a practical matter, is that by moving to Medina, they could no longer pray towards both qiblas, both points of prayer, and they therefore had to choose one. Since it's the new religion is centered in the Hijaz, they were instructed to pray to the Kaaba.
So during Prophet Muhammad's time in Medina, you mentioned something about, there were in your book, you mentioned about the battles that had ensued from Medina. And by the way, I really commend you on your work translating the Quran, because I really liked your translation, and I hope, as we privately had discussed, that you would publish potentially more, you would expand more on your translation on the Quran. So in terms of what happened on these various battles, the Quran had mentioned that essentially Prophet Muhammad and his and the believers and all the people who were on his side were in fact not only defending the city of Medina, but they were defending the churches and the Roman Empire, or the synagogues and the places of worship from the pagans, from the pagans. Attacks and aggression, and I find this very interesting. I just the way how you put it in the book.
Well, that assertion comes from the Quran itself. There is, in the Medina period, there's a verse that says, had it not been for the stand that the believers took, the battles that they were willing to fight and risk their lives in, then churches and monasteries and such institutions would have been destroyed. And this verse is very obscure. The traditional Muslim tafsir tradition doesn't know exactly what to do with it. And they often, the traditional Muslim scholars were very bright and very knowledgeable, but they most often didn't know foreign languages. And they couldn't see, some of them could. So Suyuti, for instance, the great Egyptian medieval scholar, has a list of Aramaic terms in the Quran. But this particular verse uses the Aramaic word for church. It's bi'a, which is not an Arabic word. But it means church. It can only mean church. Right. There isn't any doubt of it. It doesn't mean temple. It doesn't, it's the Aramaic Christian word for church, which is then brought into the Quran. And so it's very clear what the verse is saying. And I tried to think, well, what could this mean? That the believers, when they fought their battles with the pagans, were protecting churches and monasteries. And I think it's because in that era, there are at least allegations that Zoroastrian troops sometimes burned churches. So the Sasanians were sometimes hard on the local Christians if they gave them any trouble. And the pagans, being allied with the Sasanians, might well also have attacked monasteries. And we know Arab tribes did attack monasteries. It was one of the tropes in the literature. So I conclude that those battles fought between Mecca and Medina, where the Muslims were defending themselves against the pagan Meccan attacks, were conceived as also making a stand that the pagans wouldn't come up from Mecca to maybe some monasteries in the northern Hijaz and attack them as well. That Medina was serving as a bulwark for protection of Christians in the northern Hijaz.
I find it fascinating, honestly, because I read the story of the Rabbi Mukhairik,
Oh yeah.
who was a Jewish rabbi who fought alongside Prophet Muhammad in one of these battles, and he died, and Prophet Muhammad labeled him as a martyr of Islam. And actually, the Rabbi Mukhairik had donated his vast wealth to the Muslims, and it became one of the largest endowments, the first largest endowments to Muslims. So this brings us very. I know I'm taking so much time of your time, but very quickly, if we address what happened in Medina, the incident that happened with the Jews, Khaybar. You had concluded in your book that there were some issues with how the traditional Sira discusses the events that were unfolding, and you don't believe that because it essentially what happened. And how was discussed in the traditional Sira, it negates or undermines the ethics of Prophet Muhammad and the Quran itself. So you find it plausible.
Yeah, well, again, my method is to take the Quran as my primary source, and if a later report uh, accords with the sense of the Quran, then I'm willing to consider it. But if it seems to directly contradict what the Quran says, then I am very suspicious of it. So the Quran has instructions for how to treat prisoners of war. It's very lenient. It says you should try to ransom them, try to get something for them from the enemy. But if you can't, and a year goes by, you should just let them go. Um, so that's how the Quran thinks you should treat prisoners of war. And then there's a verse condemning Pharaoh,
Mm.
which says that he attacked people, killed the men, and enslaved the women. This is pharaonic, this is evil, this kind of behavior, and according to the Quran, killing the men of the conquered population and then enslaving the women. The Quran doesn't forbid slavery, but it doesn't approve of it. It's a hasana, it's a good deed if you let a slave go. What does that imply?
Mm.
If it's a good deed, if you let the slave go, it must be a bad deed to keep the slave enslaved.
Of course. Yeah.
So ethically, not legally, but ethically, I think the Quran puts a moral obligation on Muslims to gradually get rid of slavery. And that's Muhammad Abduh and the other great Muslim modernist theologians take this stance as well. Well, so and the Quran actually doesn't mention the death penalty except for murder. So of course, in war, people are killed, but that's hand-to-hand combat. But a POW, a prisoner of war, is not in combat. They're helpless. Their hands are tied up. There's no indication in the Quran that they should be treated in this way. So there is a story that appears in the later biographies of the Prophet. Again, these are 150, 200, 300 years after the fact, that they tell stories about the Jews of Medina, some portion of them, and it's implied a majority of them, turn against the Prophet. They start attacking him. They try to assassinate him. And there's nothing like that in the Quran, by the way. There's no verse of the Quran that says, "Oh, Jews, why did you try to assassinate me?" Right? There's nothing like that in the Quran. In fact, Jews are mentioned along with Christians as eligible for paradise if they live righteous lives. So in these later tales, there are these Jews conspiring against the Prophet, and some of them ally with the Meccan pagans, which could have happened. So they, the story is that the early Muslim fighters came out of Medina and had a battle with the Jews of Khaybar, who were allies of the Meccan pagans who were trying to destroy Medina, and defeated them. And then took 600 men, it is said, captive, and then murdered these captives after they were helpless, and then enslaved their women. That's what the Sira literature alleges. I just don't find it plausible. Uh, According to the Quran, that's not how Muslims were supposed to be behaving. They behaved like Pharaoh. And I think this is a later story. I think whoever wrote it had problems with his Jewish neighbors and was projecting them back to the time of the Prophet. I think there are many stories in the Sira that are like that are later kind of folk tales. And by the way, the Sira, or the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, as written by people like Ibn Ishaq or Waqidi and so forth, has never been viewed by the Muslim tradition as unassailable. There's never been a sense that you can't criticize the Sira literature. In fact, the scholars who focus on the hadith, on the sayings and doings of the Prophet and his companions, the reports that come down orally, are often very critical of the Sira, because Ibn Ishaq and al-Waqidi don't give chains of transmission. They don't tell you how exactly they came by these reports. But I, as a historian, I just view some of these later reports as just implausible given what is in the Quran. It's not the way the Quran depicts the early Muslims as behaving.
You find it as a systemic issue on this specific the exegetical work after the death of Prophet Muhammad, and you mentioned in one of your papers where you argue that between the recitation of the Quran by the Prophet Muhammad and the production of the first Muslim religious texts in the 8th century under the Umayyad dynasty, a linguistic shift took place that limited the meaning of Muslim and Islam to the religion of Muhammad. So it seems that this was systemic, because not only is it on this specific story, but as well you have even terminologies like jizya. In your book, you talk about jizya, that it does not have any really roots of taxation on non-Muslims or non-believers. And I find this extremely important, because this is where the issues, I guess, started after the death of Prophet Muhammad, where they played with these terminologies in order to implement whatever political or whatever goals they had in mind, including taxation. And so they used this jizya as an example.
Yeah, I think that the Muslim empires that grew up after the Prophet's death viewed the Quran as their charter, but in many ways there were some parts of the Quran that were inconvenient for them. And so they developed exegetical or interpretive tools to try to avoid it seeming that they were doing things that were contrary to the Quran. I think, for instance, the later Muslim empires came into conflict with the Byzantine Empire, the late Roman Empire, and that the Surat Rum, the verse in the Quran that praises the Roman emperor and predicts his victory and says it's the victory of God, that became very inconvenient, for the Abbasid caliphs who were fighting wars against the Byzantine Empire.
Right.
And so they tried to find some other way of interpreting it. So I mean, the easy thing is just to say, well, Muhammad and the Roman Empire were maybe aligned in the 620s. It doesn't mean that the Muslim polity and the Byzantine Empire would always be friends, but that's not how they did it. They wanted to project their circumstances back into the past, and so they came up with ways of interpreting the Quran that suited their condition. So, the Surah Toba, the ninth surah, and which I believe is largely about the Battle of Hunain, after Mecca greeted the Prophet, let him back in 630, and largely embraced the new religion of Islam. The tribes in the region were disturbed by this, because if you have Medina and Mecca both under the Prophet's authority, that begins to look like a state. And we've already concluded that the Hijazi tribes didn't like states. They didn't want to be under the thumb of one. So the Hawazin tribe and the tribes of the city of Taif, according to the later tradition, decided to attack and try to smother this new state in its crib, and to roll the Prophet back from Mecca. And so the Muslims had to go out from Mecca and Medina to south towards Taif, to a dry riverbed of Hunain, and they fought the Hawazin and the Taif tribes, and they won. And by the way, the prisoners were taken of the Hawazin, and the Prophet went and visited them and released them all, according to these later sources. So that's another indication of how POWs were actually treated. But in any case, I think that if you read the ninth chapter of the Quran, Surah Toba, Repentance, in a linear way, if you start at the beginning and just read it all the way through, it tells the story of the Battle of Hunain. That's what it's about. But verse 29, which I think it's about Hawazin, says that it condemns people who don't believe in the last day and in the one God. And the verse is difficult Arabic, and it can be read to be saying that it's condemning the Jews and the Christians who don't believe in one God in the last day, which is how the Abbasids read it, how the later Muslim exegetes read it. But that makes no sense at all. Every single part of the Quran is full of assertions that Jews and Christians believe in God in the last day. And you showed the verse 262 from Surah Al-Baqarah. Those who believe, the Jews, the Christians, the Sabians, and whoever has believed in God in the last day and performed good works, they shall have the reward within the Lord. So 929 can't possibly be talking about Jews and Christians. It's talking about the Hawazin, about the pagan tribes. And it says they were given a book, Utul Kitab. Well, ordinarily in the Quran, that does mean that they were given the Bible or they were given scripture. But the word kitab, al-kitab, also could mean a treaty. And actually, the beginning of the Constitution of Medina says this is al-kitab between the people of Medina and the Prophet Muhammad. So I think the Surah, the 929, is saying that those people who were given the book, that is to say the treaty, the Hawazin had made a peace treaty with the Prophet, and who broke it, and who don't believe in God, the one God, and in the last day, have to pay reparations for having attacked the Prophet and his followers at Hunain. And the word is related to jizya. The word used there is jaza. They have to pay reparations. And that's what the word means in that Arabic of the time of the Quran. Now, the Sasanian Empire, the Iranian Empire, had a custom of taking a poll tax on people who were not Zoroastrians. And after the Prophet's death, of course, the Muslims conquered Iran. And when they made Baghdad their capital much later, they took on a lot of Sasanian customs.
Interesting.
They were very much under Sasanian influence. And Baghdad is a Persian city. in its architecture. And so, and the word for poltax in Persian was very similar to the root jaza in Arabic. So I think, and I'm not alone in this, a lot of historians think that the jizya is an adoption of this Sasanian poll tax. It's not a Quranic custom, and they tried to relate it to 929, but I think only by vastly misinterpreting what the verse was about.
So these are like jizya. These are the sorts of words that requires digging in deeper and trying to resolve the misrepresentation of these words. And I really I appreciate your work on this, because now you start really, especially for Arabs, because Arabs, when they read the Quran, they think they know the Quran because they know the language, but in fact the Arabic found in the Quran is quite different and unique, and these subtle things could dramatically change the entire verse. um, and this compounded ignorance that can happen in among Arabs, especially who read the Quran, could be problematic, really, especially if they start teaching others about it. So, do you think that racism played a part as well during the Abbasid, when, essentially the Arabs were trying to kind of impose their points of view, especially the exegetes? Because I've noticed reading history books, I've seen how the non-Arabs have kind of took a back seat on some of these various issues. I mean, now we go into politics of how the Abbasid and the Umayyads wanted to kind of control the narrative and control the meanings of these words and so on. Because I found the non-Arabs exegetes, or they kind of put in more effort in understanding some of the these various terminologies in the Quran.
That's interesting. Well, I just think that the later Muslim tradition, first of all, it's very diverse. And nowadays, with the rise of Salafism and kind of hardline interpretations of the Quran, there's a tendency to go back in history and find the Ibn Taymiyyah or some relatively rigid medieval scholar and exalt them and reprint them and make them widely available. But nobody read Ibn Taymiyyah. People were reading Ibn Arabi. The mystics were much more popular in the medieval period. So, there was one. There were scholars who tried to say that the Quran is full of these injunctions to turn the other cheek, essentially. Do good to those who do evil to you, the Quran says. If somebody is taunting you, harassing you, withdraw from them graciously. Wish them peace. Be humble. And these kinds of verses, which are frequent in the Quran, were very unwelcome to the Abbasid Empire, which was a warrior empire and was engaged in conquest, and they didn't want people being humble and turning the other cheek. So some of them would say things like that verse 929 that I was talking about abrogates all of the peace verses. Mm-hmm. But we don't have to obey any of those peace verses because the later verses talked about war. Right. Well, I mean, that's ridiculous. No indication in the Quran that our civil interactions with one another, person to person, were abrogated by the necessity of getting up these defensive wars against the attacking pagans. And in Christianity of that time, this distinction was openly recognized. So St. Augustine, St. Ambrose, the church fathers of the late antique period routinely supported the Christian Roman army in its wars, including against Iran. But if you asked them about Jesus saying turn the other cheek, they would say that's for interpersonal relations. If you're in a city, you have neighbors, that's how you have to treat your neighbors. It's not, they openly said, killing someone is forbidden, but on the battlefield, it's praiseworthy. And so I think the tendency has been both on the Muslim side and on the Christian European side to disregard the peace verses of the Quran, which again are very numerous and very central to the text, just because there are war verses, but the war verses are a small part of the text. I have one Muslim friend who estimated that the Prophet Muhammad may have been at war for 6 afternoons in his lifetime. And even in the later Medina texts, which do admit the necessity of defensive war, there are many verses which encourage peace. It says, it tries to prepare the Muslims for peace with Mecca. It says, it may be that God will arrange for you to love people that you now hate, and you're not to attack people who were neutral during the war, who didn't do anything to you, even if maybe their political sympathies were with your enemies. So there's a lot of emphasis on reconciliation and peacemaking, even in the later chapters of the Quran. And there are Western Orientalists who, want to see a progression from more peaceful verses to more warlike verses, and over time. And I don't think that's the way it works at all. The emphasis on peace and conciliation is constant. It's just that the situation changed. In Mecca, it was a shrine, a sanctuary, where according to Arab custom, you weren't allowed to feud or fight. And so I don't believe that the Muslims in Mecca were being attacked physically. It wouldn't have been socially acceptable. They were harassed, taunted, they were boycotted probably, but they weren't. Nobody was beating them up. But when they went to Medina, it's not a sanctuary, and it was possible for then the Meccans to openly attack it without any reputational loss. If you attacked somebody in Mecca, people would look down on you, that you're breaking the rules of sanctuary. But if you attack them in Medina, well, that's war. And so I think the situation was different in Medina. They were more of a community; they had to defend themselves, and it was a different atmosphere than in Mecca. But those Abbasid scholars, and they were a small minority who wanted to abrogate all the peace verses, were engaged in imperial propaganda. That's what it was. And we should be suspicious of them. We shouldn't be reprinting their books and spreading them around all the street corners in the Middle East.
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen Islamophobes and Muslim extremists, they try to leverage on these misconceptions. And the Quran is filled with examples of the necessity to uphold peace. And I'm just amazed with the amount of soft diplomacy that the Quran has, by essentially capturing or being inclusive and trying to unite people, whether this is these various monotheistic heritages like Rahman, Ar-Rahman. You've mentioned in your book, that it traces to Yemen, where they found this inscription. And going back quickly to Yemen, I know I've been taking a lot of your time. It's about that soft diplomacy where it worked and it converted an entire country into Islam. And so that's kind of interesting, because the believers, or the Prophet, they didn't need to fight Yemenis. They just managed to craft a letter, and an interesting approach, and the leaders in Yemen accepted it. And
Right.
that's it.
The children of the Iranian officers who invaded Yemen in 570, those Iranian troops and officers took local Yemeni wives and had children. And then when they died, their children took over as a kind of military junta. And they were initially loyal to the Sasanian Empire, of course. And they were called in Arabic al-abna, the sons of the Sasanian officers. Well, they were ruling Yemen during the time the Prophet was in Medina. They were in charge of Yemen, and there's nothing about it in the Quran itself, although there may be hints. But Al-Tabari, the great historian, tells the story that the Prophet sent the Quran to, or the message of the Quran to the Abna, to the Sasanian or half Sasanian rulers of Yemen. And their leader was, in Arabic, the word is Badan. I don't know what the original Iranian name was. It's obviously not exactly transcribed in the Arabic, but he was Badan bin Sasan, that he accepted the Prophet's message. And then once he did, since he was the chief general, all the other Abna also converted. And since they ruled Yemen, Islam became the religion of state. Already in the Prophet's lifetime, this is supposed to have happened in, say, 628 or so, according to Tabari. It was only after Badan died that the Prophet then sent some companions down, and Ali ultimately among them, his son-in-law and cousin, to Yemen to rule the place. But according to Tabari, there was no conquest of Yemen by the early Muslim armies. The Yemeni ruling elite acquiesced in Islam and was very impressed by the Quran. I speculate a little bit that, Zoroastrians have beliefs that are very similar to Muslims and Christians. They believe in the one good God, and they have a prophet, Zarathustra. They have scriptures, the Gathas. And they also believe in the Judgment Day and the resurrection. And in fact, they may have been the first religion that believed in the resurrection. And they believe that at the end of time, a savior figure will come called the Saoshyant. He's kind of like the Jewish Messiah, or for Christians, the return of Christ. And I just wonder, because we know that at the time of the Prophet in the Near East, there was a lot of speculation that it was the end of the world, and the Quran reflects this sense of impending doom. Maybe the Zoroastrian rulers of Yemen might have seen the Prophet Muhammad as the Saoshyant. They may have seen him as the promised one of Zoroastrianism who would arise at the end of days. So then there's a late verse of the Quran, which, it talks about the Jews and the Christians and the various monotheists. And in this late verse, it also mentions the Majus, which is the Arabic word for Zoroastrian.
Yes.
And it mentions Christians, Jews, Muslims, Zoroastrians. And then it says, and the Mushrikun, and the polytheists. So I read the verse that it's not putting the Zardushtis and not putting the Zoroastrians in with the Mushrikun. They're a separate group, and they're being grouped with the Christians and the Jews. And I just speculate that if Tabari's story is right, that this verse may be, a way of including those Yemeni Zoroastrians in the Ummah that now they're converting.
There was a form of soft diplomacy from the Quran too. I mean, it kind of helped the Abna, the Zoroastrians in Yemen, to kind of take that leap of faith, because essentially, not many, like Prophet Muhammad, took him a while until he could convince people intellectually to embrace the Quran. It wasn't that easy, but to have Yemen to this mass conversion. But it seems that Yemen has this history of converting en masse. We've seen Judaism spread, right?
Yeah,
It was this.
And then Christianity during Abraha's period, although Christianity in Yemen was spread by the sword.
And Judaism at one point too, it was you had at the later period when you had Jewish kings who were extremely intolerant in Yemen. But it seems that Yemenis, they calculate risk. They see what's possible, what's not possible, and they take a leap of faith. And I wanted to ask you about the Jews of Yemen, because essentially they played a role too, because as you contend in your book, that Prophet Muhammad might have met them during his trips to south of Arabia and spoke to them, and they understood the Quran, they read the Quran, and they accepted the Quran because of their understanding of the Quran. If you don't mind me, I'll just read this very quickly. That what you said. You said in the book, the script Zubur, to which the Quran refers here, was used for the southern Sabaic language, but apparently expatriate Arabic speakers in Yemen in the period also adopted it. Muhammad held out Arab Jews' ability to read the new scripture in it, and their affirmation of its similarity to the Bible as proofs of its validity. So it seems that you singled out the Yemeni Jews as well in playing an important role here. Do you differentiate the Yemeni Jews with the Jews in Hijaz and in Palestine, since they might be looked at, Gentile Jews, possibly, or?
Yeah, well, we don't really have very solid evidence about the Jews in this period. Christian Robin thought that Abraham maybe polished them all off, and there weren't any Yemeni Jews by the time the Sasanians came in. But Bowersock thinks that there was a community that remained and that they allied with the Sasanians. And so we just don't know very much about it. But this verse of the Quran that I mentioned, it says that when we show the Quran to...
yeah, please continue. I can hear you.
When we show the Quran to the learned, to the rabbis of the Jewish community, it doesn't say Yemen, in Zubur, that they recognize it as the word of God. And so Robin and others have made this discovery that Zubur was the name for Sabaic writing. And they used to write on wooden strips or on stone. They would make stone inscriptions of the sort that you showed earlier. And that was called Zubur. So it's a technical term for Sabaic writing. So the way I interpret this verse is that, and it's not just me, there a great scholar of the Arabs named Retzo suggested this, is that some verses of the Quran were written for these Jews in the Zubur script, which they read, and then they wrote the Bible in Zubur. And once they could see what the Quran was saying, praising the one God and, talking about the prophets of the Hebrew Bible and so forth, that the rabbis were positive towards this message. And in Judaism, there is a tradition of recognizing the righteous Gentile. And that may be how they viewed the prophet. So the Quran says this, that when the Quran is written out in Zabur for these Jews, that they recognize it. Well, since it's Zabur, I'm guessing that these were Yemeni Jews that it was being shown to. And I don't know. Were they refugees from Abraha who had come up to the Hijaz, or were they still in Sana'a? I just don't know. But that's the only way that I can, as a historian, and given what we now know from the archaeology, that I can make sense of this verse. So I do point out, however, that it's an Arabic Quran. Even if it's written in Sabaic script, it would still be written in Arabic, and that these Jews who could read Zabur, which I presume were Yemeni Jews, are being held out as true Arabs, as exemplars, better than the Arab pagans who boasted about their uruba and their Arabness, and they had the great poetry of battle days and the mu'allaqat and so forth. But the Quran is praising these Jews as recognizing the truth of the Arabic Quran.
It's really kind of interesting afterwards to see Yemen then adopting or embracing Islam. And I've been working on some research on the various mosques, because one of the oldest mosques in the Islamic world are found in Yemen, because they were quickly embraced the tradition, and so you have these various mosques in the Tahama region, like the one that belongs to one of the Sahaba, or one of the companions of the Prophet Muhammed al-Ash'ari, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari. And so and even Yemenis built their newly acquired Islamic tradition on what they had of various pre-Islamic traditions. They had on the whether that was Himyarite tradition and so on. So I'm just trying to kind of fast forward here until the modern days right now. And you visited Yemen in the 80s, and I believe in the 90s
And
too,
90s.
twice.
Yeah.
And so Yemen continued to play an extremely vital vital role. I mean, geopolitically, of course, it is still very relevant um, because of its geographic location, but as well because of its heritage. And I can share. I'm sharing here with you, as you know, this is the manuscripts found in the old mosque of Sana'a, which is an extremely important finding, because it traces back. You mentioned in the book or one of your articles that some of them were carbon dated, and these manuscripts answered extremely important question, and they continue to answer very important question, because Yemenis essentially they managed to preserve these important manuscripts, whereas in many regions in the Arabian Peninsula, such artifacts and manuscripts have kind of been somehow lost. But I thought just to get your opinion about your experience in Yemen, and I don't remember if you came across these manuscripts.
Yes. Well,
In
the
person.
second time I went to Yemen in I think it was '94, I visited the Dar al Quran, which is a subset of the, and they had brought in a German team. There was a woman there named Ursula Dreibholz, who was working with manuscripts. His most remarkable story, the question arises both for Jews and Muslims what to do with an old piece of scripture once your Bible or your Quran is all worn out and is falling apart. What do you do with it? You can't throw it away. It's got the name of God on it. So the Jews had a tradition of burying them. It was called a geniza. And the Muslims in Sana'a did something similar right from the time of the Prophet, apparently, or shortly thereafter. And there was a room in the Grand Mosque that they would put these old Qurans. Over the centuries, several hundred old Qurans were deposited there. But then gradually that room got bricked up and nobody knew it was there. So they were doing renovation work at the Grand Mosque in the early 70s, and workers were tearing down a wall. They found this room, and it was just littered with these old pages. If you looked at them, it was clear that they were Quran pages. The bindings had all disintegrated, so they were just loose pages, and they would all become mixed up. And so Dreibholz and her team from Germany were assigned, and I asked her what she did there, and she said, well, we measure each of the pages, how long it is, how tall it is, and then what its material is. It parchment? Is it papyrus? The script, is it Madani? Is it Kufi? And so forth. And we make a drawer, and every page that fits exactly the description of the first page, we put it in the same drawer. And gradually they were building up complete Qurans from these loose pages. And she told me, and this in '94 was before they understood exactly what they had there, I think. She told me that they were convinced that some of those Qurans were from the decades immediately after the Prophet Muhammad, that they were very early. And this was a time when there was a lot of Western academic skepticism about the Quran and wondering exactly what its dates were. The Muslims said that it's 610 to 632, but was it like, say, the Gospels, which went on being added to, until 80 AD or later? And so there was a lot of academic skepticism. But she was convinced already, just from the work that they had done, that some of these are very early. It shows the Quran is very early. And then in the later 90s, they discovered this palimpsest. A palimpsest is a manuscript that's been written over. Like if you, for any reason, parchment, animal skin parchment was very expensive. And only rich people really had books of that sort. And if for some reason they were tired of the old book, they would wash off the ink and write a new one over it. Or if the ink had become somewhat faded, they could just take dark ink and write a new book over it. So that's a palimpsest. There's another book underneath. And there was a Quran, which was a palimpsest. And now you have imaging equipment like an MRI you give to human beings. You can give the manuscript an MRI basically, and you can recover the text underneath. And they did this. So the Sana'a 1, this manuscript, underneath the standard Uthmani Quran that was written on top of it, there was another version of the Quran, which is not exactly in the Uthmani order.
Yes.
And some of the verses have some minor variations in them from what we now have. They're nothing major and it doesn't change the meaning. But, it might say kadhalika instead of dhalika, or, these minor words might be changed. Meaning
are these like mistakes possibly made during the writing on the perch itself, and then they try to...
Well, what we think is that until Uthman made a standard edition in 654, everybody used to keep their own Qurans.
Yes.
And so it's always possible to misremember how exactly the Prophet said it. And this is mentioned in the early Muslim sources, that people weren't even too concerned about it. If the Quran says someone is cowardly, there might be two words for coward, and one is in one manuscript, one is in another. These kind of variations existed. Then once Uthman, the Caliph Uthman, made a standard recension, all the others were destroyed, and you only have the one. But this Sana'a palimpsest seems to be pre-Uthmanic. It's been carbon dated. 75% chance it's 645 or before. So it would be Omar period. It's incredible.
Yes, it is.
It's absolutely incredible. Yeah. It's a huge treasure for the world. I pray and hope every day that it's safe because it's there in Sana'a during the war. But it's an intellectual revolution, because that skepticism among academics about the age of the Quran, that's just, you might as well toss that away now. People who were saying, well, maybe Muslims went on adding to the Quran until the time of Abdul Malik or later. That's just impossible now. I mean, if we take these findings seriously, this is a very early Quran, maybe from the time of Omar, and so it's Yemen that solved this problem for us as a repository, as you say, of these great manuscript traditions and Muslim learning, and it's very precious. This Dar al-Quran, as I said, I have heard that the people who are in charge of it have hidden it very carefully, and that it's not in danger of being bombed or taken over by various groups, but I don't know. And it has been microfilmed, but you learn certain things from seeing the original. And it's very precious.
It is, and I kind of what I was told that they're likely to be saved safe in a very secure place because, as you said, it's a treasure, and it did answer so many questions. And I guess Yemen came to the rescue on this one.
Yeah.
So the soft diplomacy of Prophet Muhammad worked out well because if it didn't work out that way, potentially Yemen could have been a Muslim country later on, many decades, and they would not have this sort of very important scriptures and artifacts. I took so much of your time, and so I just wanted like last words from you concerning the prejudice on Prophet Muhammad and his message and what he preached for. In You have this in whether it's Western academia, but it seems that the world and the technology has been bridging nations. Although I must say that internet is sometimes doesn't help that much because you do have these crazy voices that emerge and even kind of push people apart. So it seems that the prejudice and how Prophet Muhammad was painted by extremists and Islamophobes kind of pushed you to write this book because of your understanding of Islam. You've been a student of Islam for many decades now, and you've been in the region, and so you felt that you're compelled to share your academic point of view on this topic. So I thought if you have any
Yes.
words on this, yeah.
I just really minded the demonization of Islam and of the Prophet. Um, my father was in the U.S. military, and we had a posting in Asmara, just across the Red Sea from Yemen, in what is now Eritrea. At that time, it was ruled by Ethiopia. In 1967 and 68. And Eritrea is about a third Muslim. So Asmara has mosques, and we had Muslim friends. And I first encountered the religion then when I was 14 and 15. And then even when we came back from the United States, my eyes had been opened to a whole new world. And we came back through Beirut, and I got interested in the Middle East. And I remember in the late 60s in the counterculture, I was reading books about Sufism, and then there was a countercultural bookstore in Washington, D.C. called the Yes Bookstore in Georgetown. And we used to go down there, and I bought a Quran, A.J. Arbery's translation of the Quran, the great Cambridge scholar, which I still have. And I read through it very carefully. And back in the early 70s. And then I ultimately did an MA in history and Arabic at the American University in Cairo. I started studying Arabic even at Northwestern as an undergraduate. And in Cairo, I studied Quran with Muhammad al-Nuwayhi, a great literary scholar. And I studied early Islam with Marsden Jones, who was a British academic who was the first one to edit the manuscripts of al-Waqidi into a printed book. And Nuwayhi had studied with Taha Hussein, and Taha Hussein had studied with Muhammad Abdu. Abdu had studied with Jamaluddin Afghani. So I maintain I'm the real Salafi. And I have that genealogy. So and then I did a dissertation at UCLA in Islamic studies. So the Islam that I knew from actually knowing Muslims and from my interest in things like Sufism and the Quran and so forth, I couldn't recognize it in what was being alleged in the United States after 9/11. I mean, there were actually city councils like Murfreesboro in Tennessee, which tried to prevent a mosque from being expanded because they saw mosques as centers of a cult-like murder cult. They didn't want to have the mosque expanded so more murders could be committed. I mean, complete xenophobic nonsense like this. And then there were these books that were written which go through and cherry pick the Quran and take it out of context and try to make the Muslims look like they're monsters and so forth. So I really dislike that. It's a subject that I addressed a lot at my blog, trying to counter it. And then you had, on the other hand, Al Qaeda and ISIL and these crazy Muslims who were they would quote half a Quran verse and deeply misinterpret the tradition and the Quran and tried to bring back slavery, which the Quran disapproves of, and so forth. So I felt on both sides that the original sources were being lost sight of, and the original message was being lost sight of. And I had long wanted to write a book like this, but I just took the bull by the horn because it wasn't an easy thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to write a book that would be offensive in any way to Muslim readers. But I did want it to be solidly academically grounded so that it would be acceptable to Westerners. And so it was a real challenge. Also, the field changed while I was away from it doing modern history because it was being set in the context now by Bowersock and others of the Roman Empire. And I knew some Greek, so that helped me. But I had to spend years just reading in late Roman history and Byzantine history and trying to get a better sense of the context and trying to read the archaeology and Robin's work on archaeology of Yemen. These were not things that I had been necessarily kept up with in the 80s and 90s. So I had to go back to it. So it was a decade's worth of work. But I'm so pleased that it has been very warmly received on both sides. Muslim audiences seem to like it a lot, and I've been invited a lot to speak at Muslim conferences. And then it was positively reviewed in the New York Times, and academic colleagues have written reviews of it that were positive. So at least that part of my aspiration has been successful.
Well, thank you so much for your work and contribution in really shedding light on this and essentially bridging the gap and resolving this huge misunderstanding. And as you said, I mean, it took you a while, but it was your effort is much appreciated, and your book will continue to live on because I've sent it. I've kind of shared it with people who are well versed with the Sira, and they find it remarkable and very original. And it challenges these various assumptions that continues to be an issue. But thank you. Essentially, you've opened the gateway. And for this interview, I truly appreciate you and your time, and you for being humble, because that's a quality of you that I truly appreciate, and I'm thankful. And many people who have done interviews with you are very much thankful to you and to your kindness. So thank you for your time. This interview, of course, is streamed live and will be uploaded on YouTube and will be divided into segments. And I will reach out to you just to make sure that it could be shared as widely as possible. And of course, your book, it's really a must to get. I mean, for Muslims and for non-Muslims. And it is grounded on academia. It's not on theology. It is purely academic, and it's very well written with amazing sourcing and many sources and notes. I know I still spend at least a couple of hours, an hour a day, at least hours a week, just to kind of go over these sources and get these books that you've worked and studied. And so you are a treasure for really humanity at this age. When you deservedly.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much, Professor Cole. It's been a pleasure, and مع السلامة. Thank you.
مع السلامة.
مع
في أمان
السلامة.
الله.
مع السلامة. Thank you.